All right, all right, all right. Good morning, good morning, good morning, beautiful people. Good afternoon, good evening. It doesn't matter what time it is. Just know today is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it. Why? Well, because God is good and He's God all the time. Duh, you know. Man, so y'all already know. We about to get into the next chapter, okay? Chapter 14, the blood at the root. You see it. You see it. Okay? Blood at the root. Baby, we gonna finish this motherfucking book, you hear me? Let's see how many chapters we got left. So today we are reading from chapter 14 on calm. And we got 18 chapters. So we got about four more. Okay, we're making some progress. Y'all. So I do want to show y'all though that I got stuff situated, right? So remember how I told y'all that I've recently gotten into music producing and all that wonderful jazz, right? So I want to show y'all I finally got it connected in the sense of you can hear it. So I'm glad of that. So yeah, you're gonna catch me making beats live. This is set to my keyboard right now, like my computer keyboard. My Yamaha is across the way. I gotta bring it to my table right here, right next to me, so I could get it linked up, and then y'all could hear me play for the long. Telling y'all. So I'm excited for that. And then y'all, I got my other ankle set up. Would you look at that? So we squared away, man. We get things going. I know the lighting ain't that great. I'm still working out some kinks. I also got to clean my office. You know, my wife comes back and I got her spot motherfucking holding some of my stuff like storage. So, man. But I ain't gonna hold y'all too long because, like I told you, I got a doctor's appointment at 3. It's 11. I still need to eat some breakfast. I ain't not trying to mess y'all up by smacking and all that wonderful jazz in the microphone. So I'm gonna get through this chapter, Lord. Okay, it ain't a long chapter. It's not a long chapter. I don't know. Let me see, because we might read 14 and 15 today. Speed it up, okay? So, anyways, without further ado, let's get into this video. Okay, I wanted to have some music. Let's get into this video. It's the only place where I know if I push D, G, and J, I get like that full. You see what I'm saying? It sounds nice. I don't know where else to push in. On this keyboard. All right, I'm messing with y'all, wasting time. Let's go, y'all. So, without further ado, let's get into it, man. Chapter 14, we starting it. We're gonna see what the time looking like, because like I told you, I got things to do today. I would like to get through 14 and 15. We'll see. So, anyways, because y'all know I'm long-winded sometimes. Yeah, baby. But anyways, okay. So let's get started, man. Without further ado. The codes of racial segregation grew more rigid and oppressive throughout the South during Woodrow Wilson's 2 terms in the White House. But no place was more committed to a complete racial cleansing than Forsyth. Tell me about it. The county gained wider notoriety as people from other parts of the state found themselves face to face with the enforcers of a white-only rule that was extraordinary, even by the standards of Jim Crow. In September of 1915, the Times Enterprise of Thomasville in South Georgia ran a story meant to shock readers with the fact that in the Georgia mountains, there was a county with a Negro in it. Every family was run out of the county, a reporter wrote, and now an automobile cannot pass through and take a colored servant. Interesting. Sorry, y'all. It kind of reminds us of those, them sundown towns. Y'all, I'm over here. Got some technical difficulties. There we go. So anyways, but it reminds me of them sundown towns. You know what I'm saying? This might be the onset of them. So anyways, an automobile cannot pass through and take a colored servant. This fact has just been ascertained by a physician who went there on a visit. That physician was Hudson Moore, a wealthy Atlanta man who had business at the Forsyth County Courthouse on September 4th, 1915. When Moore drove north to Cumming, he took with him a colored nurse and colored chauffeur and left them waiting in the car while he went inside. Witnesses said that while Moore was speaking with officials, he heard a commotion outside. In rushing out, he found a crowd. That sounds about right. You got a herd of people ready to jump on them. A crowd of several hundred gathered around the two servants, several hundred for two people, threatening them. Mr. Moore took his two employees in his automobile and rushed them out of the county. What Dr. Moore clearly hadn't realized was that by their very presence on the Cumming Square, his black employees were committing what many local whites now regarded as a hanging offense. So their existence, just being in that location, is worth a hanging. Interesting. Not long after Moore's harrowing trip, another group of white aristocrats would make the same mistake when they took part in an automobile tour of North Georgia hill country and brought their black chauffeurs onto the wrong side of the Chattahoochee River. Looking to capitalize on a recent craze from glamorous driving tours, in the fall of 1915, the Georgia Chamber of Commerce organized an event called Seeing Georgia, which would lead a group of automobile enthusiasts through the northern region of the state, staying each night in different towns. Seeing Georgia attracted the interest of mayors, business leaders, and society women. This makes me think of like the women's suffrage type society women, the same women that had their hands in creating a juvenile delinquency, segment of the criminal justice department or the criminal justice field. They also created CPS, basically any and everything that seemed like they terrorized children for being terrors. But just like the carceral system for adults, the juvenile delinquency, right, is disproportionately colored and poor kids. Just saying. But anyways, let's continue. Seeing Georgia attracted the interest of mayors, business leaders, and society women, as well as northern capitalists looking to make investments in the South. The list of participants included many bold-faced names such as Charles J. Hayden, president of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. Why is this word butchering me? James Price, state commissioner of agriculture, and K.G. Matheson, president of Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. There were also prominent businessmen like A.C. Webb, manager of Atlanta's first Studebaker dealership, and Wiley West, a former race car driver who was now a regional manager for the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. When Cumming Mayor Charlie Harris learned that the tour would bring a group of rich and powerful men into the foothills, he used his connections at the Georgia Chamber of Commerce to get Forsyth County added to the proposed route. Harris knew that Seeing Georgia was a rare opportunity to promote his home county and to show the whole state just and to show the whole state just how much money could be made there once the Atlanta Northeastern Railroad was complete. After driving from Macon to Milledgeville and then to Athens, the second leg of the tour entered the North Georgia mountains, where the tourists viewed the colorful fall foliage and spent a night near a state-of-the-art hydroelectric plant at Tallulah Falls. The group was then scheduled to turn back south toward Hall County and from there to drive west for a brief stopover at Cumming. But during their lunchtime break in Gainesville, a group of Hall residents urged tour leaders to decline Charlie Harris's invitation and skip Forsyth County altogether. The reason for their concern? Many of the cars carrying affluent white men and women were being driven by uniformed black chauffeurs. After hearing warnings about rabid white mobs, several of the drivers asked for permission to go home by train from Gainesville, hoping to avoid the White County, where Hudson Moore employees had nearly been lynched just a month before. Interesting. According to reporters, when Harris learned that the tourists might cancel their visit, he dispatched a messenger who drove to Gainesville at breakneck speed. Harris's man arrived just as tour organizers were debating whether or not to take a detour. And he assured the participants that their black drivers would encounter no problems. How can you ensure that when you're dominated by poor white individuals whom are the terrorizers of the community? Let's continue. Steady rain on the morning of Monday, October 4th, turned the red clay road between Gainesville and Cumming into a quagmire. A journalist, Emma Martin, covering the Seeing Georgia tour for the Macon Telegraph, said the long line of automobiles needed frequent help from locals as they made their way west. The good farmers of Hall County came to our rescue by the dozens, she wrote. And whenever we skidded, they came on foot and on horseback and went with us to Forsyth County line. But as they rounded a curve and saw Brown's Bridge coming into view, Martin learned that even the white farmers of Hall now thought of Forsyth as a world apart and treated the county line as more than just a border between two local governments. They would not cross the bridge, Martin said, because of our Negro chauffeurs. Many times we were warned not to enter Forsyth. But we had the personal pledge of the mayor of Cumming and of the better element of the community that there would be neither trouble nor danger. Having put their faith in their lives, in the lives of their drivers, in the hands of Charlie Harris, he curses any man who puts his faith, trust in man. That's what the Bible says. Don't you put your faith in something so wavery, so susceptible to faltering. Goodness, Jesus. Having put their faith and their lives and the lives of their drivers in the hands of Charlie Harris, the tourists soon realized that they had made a serious mistake. Would you look at that? After rattling over the Chattahoochee River on the narrow wood-planked bridge, the long line of cars rode into a sleepy little crossroads settlement that the maps referred to as Oscarville, which is now known as Lake Lanier. It was exactly the kind of quaint rural village that the organizers had promised the tour would feature. But, according to a reporter for the Georgian, farmers at the hamlet spied a Negro chauffeur in the car of a W.A. McCullough of Atlanta and went after him. One threw a stick of stove wood that passed dangerously near the head of the frightened. That's crazy. It threw me off because of the word that they used to refer to the black man. One threw a stick of stove wood that passed dangerously near the head of the frightened darky and also near Mr. McCullough and his guests. Why the freak they call the black man darky? That's a weird joke. When McCullough's car hove into sight, said another witness, one of the men saw the Negro chauffeur driving and shouted, "Look yonder, boys, get him, get him." As the car shot past, one of the men grabbed a stick and let it fly. From there on to coming, or excuse me, from there on into coming, there were frequent curses and threats and rocks hurled at the cars. The tour's genteel passengers came from some of the wealthiest families in Georgia, and it is easy to imagine their horrified faces as they peered out through muddy windshields and got their first look at the cursing, violent white mountaineers. They fellow people. Mountaineers of Forsyth. The only difference between them is wealth. Skidding and fishtailing over the rain-soaked roads, the black drivers raced out of Oscarville and toward what they hoped would be a safe haven at the county seat. A smiling Charlie Harris was waiting for them on the coming square, and after hearing reports of the trouble out in Oscarville, the mayor assured everyone that their ordeal was over and that the black drivers were now perfectly safe. You always got mayors and governors and such just lying. Like, nigga, you can't even control your own household. How the freak you can go control people in the community that make up the residents in your city, town, village? It's crazy. Anyways, let's continue. The Constitution said Harris was most cordial and reassured the tourists that there would be no harm done to anyone, as school children lined up and sang songs. But when word spread that there were black men sitting in a row of cars lined up outside the coming courthouse, mob spirit boiled up all over town. The children had just finished their performance, and the tourists were hurrying to get back on the road when things took on a more serious aspect. According to one reporter, several men gathered around the wrong car and threatened to take from it the Negro chauffeur. One man caught a hold of the Negro's arm and said, "I've got his arm. Somebody take his legs." Mr. Simpson warned them not to execute their threat and ordered the Negro to speed up until the car shot out of line and forged past the others. After months of anticipation, seeing Georgia had finally brought to Forsyth exactly the kinds of businessmen and deep-pocketed investors who could help Charlie Harris transfer coming into a prosperous railroad town. But all he could do was watch in horror as one car after another roared down Main Street at full throttle, pursued by a mob of screaming, rock-throwing whites. Emma Martin told readers that she and several other ladies on the tour were transferred to a speedy Ford and shot through the town and county like a bullet out of a 12 centimeter to avoid the rocks and profanity being hurled. With their new car now being driven by one of the white tourists, the black chauffeurs sat on the seat with me, Martin said, while Mrs. Wall, her hand on a pistol, sat in front. Martin hunkered down below the height of the doors as they sped toward the county line, and when she looked over, she saw that the black man next to her was quite pale with fear. Finally, she said, we passed a cabin on the porch of which sat a Negro woman. At that, the driver sprang up and said, I know we's back in God's country now, and we were. There was great indignation when reports of the attacks reached Atlanta, and many of the participants in Seeing Georgia vowed to speak out against the mobs who tried to lynch their employees. When the tour stopped for supper in Tate, a lawyer and former Superior Court judge named Wright Willingham addressed reporters and called on state leaders to take action against Forsyth's racial ban. A sense of duty, Willingham said, will not permit me to remain silent over a liability which thrusts itself upon us in the beautiful county of Forsyth, where we were confronted with a spirit on the part of many of the citizens of that county, which is the antithesis of all the virtues we have discovered elsewhere. And this, because every Negro man, woman, and child has been exiled from their homes, and because a few of our tourists had Negro drivers, culminating in an effort at coming on the part of Forsyth County citizens to take one of the Negro drivers from the car and to do with him the Lord knows what. Had one passenger not reached for his revolver, Willingham said, there might have been another lynching on the Cumming Square in full sight of the mayor. The Seeing Georgia tourists cowering in their cars and school children standing with songbooks tucked in their arms. Conditions like this, Willingham went on, can no longer be rewarded, or excuse me, conditions like this, Willingham went on, can no longer be regarded with calm satisfaction, but must commend themselves to the patriotic men of our state. The governor of Georgia, the men who represent the state in the legislature, the judges of the superior courts cannot pass in silence over this state of anarchy which is being bred in this commonwealth. Ultimately, unless checked, it will bury its fangs in the body politic. As he sat in his office at the Cumming courthouse, scanning the headlines on the morning of October 5th, 1915, Charlie Harris must have been despondent. Only a day earlier, reporters visiting North Georgia for the first time had described how the wonders of this section fill one with an inexpressible sense of having been through a land of resources and a profound respect for the possibilities of the country. Businessmen all over the South read about the mineral riches of Dahlonega, the enchanted country of the Nacoochee Valley, and the network of paved roads that was being built in Hall County. But on that Tuesday morning, after Harris had worked for months to ensure that the tour passed through Cumming, journalists told a very different story about Forsyth. All over the state, people read about wives who held off the mobs with drawn pistols. Newspapers as far away as Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and New York spoke not of the resources and business opportunities in Harris' home county, but of its widespread bigotry. Georgia crackers rock Negro chauffeurs, one headline read. Stoned by Georgia mob, said another. The messenger to his investors in Atlanta was unmistakable. The message to his investors in Atlanta was unmistakable. Harris had tried since 1912 to reassure them that Forsyth was the ideal terminus for a rail spur linking the state capital to the foothills. But the very first delegation of business leaders who'd gone there at the invitation of the mayor and the Georgia Chamber of Commerce had been stoned and cursed by furious white men who tried to lynch their black chauffeurs. See, wealthy white people, on average, don't give a damn about nothing, nobody, until they experience the mayhem. Then that's when change starts to come about. That's when they start, depending on their networks and reaching out, and they're like, hey, we need some legislative change because you got people wreaking havoc and I'm terrified and I'm a wealthy white elitist. And if I'm terrified, there gots to be a problem, right? Nobody gave a damn about the feud that has been going on amongst black and white people for all these, years, up until them poor white dudes and women showed up at the Capitol, about 4 years ago? And then now you got all these prominent, prestigious white people with money, these affluent white people who's motherfucking bent out of shape from fear. Because they like, hold on. Usually we could keep the colored people in check. But when you got a mob of white angry folk coming for white people, your money ain't stopping nothing. Especially, this is why I tell people when it comes to the criminal justice system, you want to dismantle the criminal justice system? It's easy. Flood them. And you flood them by adding to their workload because they don't have the funds to process their caseload and they don't have the manpower. This is why wealthy people are fearful of the poor, because there's just more of us than them. So that's why they keep us, feuding with each other, using tactics like divide and conquer. Got niggas beefing over who could say nigga because they raised in poverty. Like, nigga, we shouldn't even be arguing about this. This is a black thing. Look at history of the relationships between white people and black people. It's tainted. It's poor. So how you think just because some time passed, now all of a sudden you could say nigga? But we feuding over stupid stuff. because people want to feel included in spaces that they know good as well. In the privacy of their community, that same group that they want to fit in with is the topic of their banter. You see what I'm saying? The message to his investors in Atlanta was unmistakable. Harris had tried since 1912 to reassure them that Forsyth was the ideal terminus for a rail spur linking the state capital to the foothills. But the very first delegation of business leaders who'd gone there at the invitation of the mayor and the Georgia Chamber of Commerce had been stoned and cursed by furious white men who tried to lynch their black chauffeurs. Soon thereafter, Charlie Harris finally gave up on his troubled railroad plan. In 1916, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued a new charter, granting a competing group the right to build an interurban line from Atlanta, Georgia, north to Roswell, thence northeast via Alpharetta to Cumming. This was the same route Harris had been struggling to open since 1908. And just like Harris's Atlanta Northeastern Railroad, it will never be completed. Instead, the mayor quietly turned his gaze southward to new opportunities far from the lawlessness that had plagued his very effort in Forsyth. The ball weevil had been introduced into Georgia in 1915, and it had quickly devastated the cotton economy of South Georgia. Remember, this is when white people was like, we no longer need the help of Negroes. We got all this machinery. You know, we are the pioneers of cotton cultivation. And then that's when they started revisioning history. Just go back to the chapter that we read prior to this one, 13. This means that just as Harris began scouting for some new venture, abandoned farms all over the region were being sold off at bargain prices from all the expulsed black people whose properties are now being unethically and immorally sold. In 1918, Harris decided to take the plunge, and he relocated from Cumming to the little town of Cordell in Crisp County, 200 miles south of Forsyth. Once there, he formed the South Georgia Land and Auction Company, and with local partners at the Cordell Bank and Trust Company, began buying and selling large parcels of farmland in South Georgia. In Cordell, Charlie Harris would make his fortune in the 1920s, investing all that energy, talent, and drive that had made him a leader in Forsyth. This is expressing to us how some of the wealth has been developed amongst Americans in the U.S., more specifically, affluent folk in Georgia. This gives us some insight as to some of the inequalities, you see what I'm saying? But let's continue. Harris's departure was in many ways the beginning of the end of resistance to the purge, as moderate figures left one by one or simply learned to hold their peace, as John and Laura Hockenhall had done. The future of Cumming was left in the hands of men like Ansel Strickland, who believed that Forsyth was and should remain a white man's county. Y'all hear that? He believes it was and should remain a white man's county. But then you have people out here who make it seem like racism never existed, still doesn't exist, nor did it have any effect on the folks' generations, afterwards, proceeding. It's crazy. But let's continue, That's why we read, for further education. You want to remain ignorant? Refrain from reading the book. Let's continue. Deputy Mitchell Gay Loomis had made a valiant attempt to stop the lynching of Rob Edwards back in 1912, and twice he tried to unseat Bill Reed as county sheriff. But not long after his second defeat in 1914, it seems that Loomis, too, had had enough of his troubled home place. If the railways of the new century would not be coming to Forsyth, Loomis decided he would go to them. Give me a second, y'all. I need to put on a little comics for the little chappy. I'll keep reading, though. When he filled out his World War I draft card in 1917, Loomis was living in Atlanta and on the payroll of the Georgia Railway and Power Company, where he worked as a motorman on the city's streetcar lines. The former deputy seems to have adapted quickly to life in the city, and he left his second wife and children back in Cumming. Left his second wife and children back in. I thought that Papa was a rolling stone. Wherever he laid his hat was his home. That's what I thought they were talking about. Like, this man got one wife at one home, a second wife another one. But they might be talking about like his second marriage, you know. Anyways, he left them at home. He would never again live in Forsyth County. The room Loomis rented at James Travis's boarding house on Piedmont Avenue was so close to the Butler Street rail yard that it said it was a popular address for streetcar drivers and train conductors. But the neighborhood was also teeming with workers and trade people of all types, including shoemakers, mechanics, barbers, plasterers, booksellers, upholsterers, and grocers. In the census, records of Atlanta's 6th Ward, where Loomis lived in 1920, one finds blacks and whites living side by side, as well as Christians and Jews, native-born Americans, and recently arrived immigrants from all over the world. And that's Atlanta's 6th Ward. Rochester kind of looks like that, but it definitely is like certain groups, like communities. Like here at the Maplewood community is very diverse and it has a heavy foreign population, immigrant population compared to the rest of Rochester. Let's continue. As he walked down Piedmont each morning heading to the Butler Street yard, Loomis would have passed people chattering in Russian, German, Yiddish, Spanish, Chinese, Turkish, and Italian. And even among his American neighbors, there were people who had come to Atlanta from all over the country. Travis's flop house may have been only an afternoon's drive south of the white county Loomis left behind, but it was in almost every way the polar opposite of Forsyth. Loomis and Harris were once the most visible white allies of the county's black residents, but only a few years after the explosions, they were gone. And with their exit, the last open opposition to the racial cleansing fell silent. They left behind a place that, unlike other counties that endured episodes of night riding and attempts at racial cleansing, had actually succeeded in closing its borders to African Americans. With no one left to speak out against the bigotry and intimidation, the county went into a kind of Rip Van Winkle sleep as residents resumed lives that on the surface looked no different from any other rural place in Georgia. White Forsyth's communal crime had been fiery and explosive in 1912, but its erasure would happen slowly, quietly, and one fence post at a time. And that is the end of chapter 14. And now we start chapter 15. What time is it? 11:38. All right, I got a little time. In a detailed survey of land transactions, journalist Elliot Jasper, so y'all can see we starting chapter 15, baby. Jasper has shown that while a small minority of Forsyth's black property owners got out early and received something close to fair market value for their land, that vast majority either sold at artificially low prices or simply walked away, knowing that their white neighbors would eventually take over their property. Each transaction is carefully recorded in oversized books in the basement of the Forsyth County Courthouse. Jaspin writes, "You need to get up in this basement, get a hold of those documents." Jaspin writes, "And each cell tells a tale of black people who struggled to build a life in Forsyth and were crushed by the terror." And the crazy part about it is that they allowed, and when I say they, the municipality allowed these transactions to go forward, even though people were violently coerced to leaving. Jasper writes, and each cell tells a tale of black people who struggled to build a life in Forsyth and were crushed by the terror. In all, 24 African American landowners and 7 churches sold their property, and the timing of these sales give a sense of the panic people felt. The worst case was Alex Hunter, who just 3 months before the explosions bought a farm for $1,500. Faced with death or leaving, he sold it in December 1912 for $550. It's kind of like what they do in cities like Atlanta, cities like Detroit, Flint, Chicago, Rochester, New York City, right? Where it's heavily black, right? It's ran down because of the systematic and systemic, like, barriers. People not being able to get adequate employment, which ultimately gives them adequate funding so they can maintain their properties and whatnot. Now, you look out in society now, these communities of black people don't look much different than what it looked like back then. This man bought his property for $1,500 and less than 3 months later sold it for $500. And this is what we see in these communities here, where black people are in them. They deem them crime-ridden. They deem them impoverished. They deem them just irredeemable. You know what I'm saying? And then all the while, they incarcerate them. They displace them through incarceration. They displace them through attrition rooted in death, health issues, because at the end of the day, if you ain't got money, ideally, you can't even afford to maintain your health. And so the black communities get so run down, and you hear a lot of people talk about it now. The property value in black communities are low. And what does that tell investors? I could come into these communities and buy up ample properties, land and all that, for little to nothing, just because of this negative attachment that people falsely attribute to black people. It's crazy. This man sold his residence for almost $1,000 less, his farmland for almost $1,000 less than what he purchased it for, because he figured I might as well sell it because the white man gonna come and take it from me anyways. They chasing everybody out. That's crazy. And that's exactly how it feels in these communities. This is why a lot of black people don't rock with cops. People overlook the fact that there's disproportionate policing in black communities. It's called ecological bias, where it's not uncommon to see police officers, predominantly police officers, excessively police areas that are full of racial minorities. Poor, but racial minorities. And then when you have that in effect, you can't be surprised when all of a sudden black people are disproportionately incarcerated. But then you have the ignorant who looks at this data and they try to put correlation and causation together, and they're saying, well, if the police is coming to your community and disproportionately arresting y'all, then y'all must be disproportionately committing all the crimes in the community. And that's just not true. You can go back to the reading of chapter 13, where I broke it down the math. It's not even plausible. It's not feasible just based on numbers alone. There's 360 million people roughly that live in the United States of America. Of that, only 14% of them are black. And when you look out in America, where do majority black people live? Mostly in communities with other black people, which are usually, unless you down south, is usually in major cities. They not really living in rural parts of America, except down south, because the southern, locale just has a larger black population than any other motherfreaking country or region in the United States. You see what I'm saying? So if black people are predominantly living in communities that are heavily packed with black people, how can rural Maine blame their crime on black people when the percentage of black people that live out there is less than 5%? It don't make no sense. White people make up over 60% of the U.S. population. They're everywhere. City, rural, town, village, it don't matter. But you think that there's colored people doing it? And it's the same garbage that is spewed in regards to immigrants. Immigrants come over here, they committing all these crimes. They're illegals, they're criminals, and all this, that, and the third. And there's ample research out there that dispels those claims, where it literally says that there are more people incarcerated. There's more people in criminal matters that are native born in comparison to those who are foreign, undocumented. But people still push these fallacies as if they're factual, even though there's all this research out there that refutes their claim and shows it to be false. But people still push them as if they're factual. It's the same pseudoscience that people use when they was trying to justify the oppression of black people by saying, well, innately they're criminalistic. You know, they come from hot climates and that heat makes them crazy. Yeah, climate theory was really a thing that was used to justify the oppression of black people. We can oppress black people because they come from Africa. They come from that hot motherfucking place. You got to be, you got to lose your mind. You got to be crazy if you could survive in scorching heat, because white people don't fare too well in heat. So they think you got to be Looney Tunes to motherfucking survive that heat. We better than you, so we gonna oppress you. Look how you working in that heat. Baby, you was born to be a slave. Pseudoscience. This is the stupid stuff that people in power make, the Voltaires of the communities. You know? The Cam Newtons, the Robert Boyles. If you look into the history, I'm telling you, these people get a lot of praise as pioneers in the world, and they pushed a lot of the disparaging racial, rhetoric that we spew today. The same rhetoric that is used against black people and immigrants today, in the times where the Greeks was on top of the world and oppressing and dominating everybody, they was using the same motherfucking rhetoric against those who weren't Greek and exalt those who were Greek. It's the same recycled motherfucking tactics. Like the Bible says, nothing new under the sun. But let's continue. I'm trying to get up out this book. I got an appointment at 3. It's almost 12. Jasper found that even after selling for a third of his land's value, Alex Hunter was still luckier than many others who simply walked away and lost everything. For 34 of the black landowners, Jasper writes, there is no record that they ever sold their land. It made no difference. Whites, money in hand, would pay the tax on land they did not own, and the clerk would note the transaction, simply ignoring the gap in ownership. In the 3 years after the expulsion, nearly 2/3 of the black-owned farmlands that had not been sold was appropriated in this way. That to me sounds like tax lien, because it said the property was not sold, but the people, the black owners, they left. And ideally, when people leave, they not paying the property taxes. And remember, we established this back in chapter 13, how predatory tax liens are. My wife and I bought our house at $189,000. We are still paying off that house. It shall not come to pass, so I bind it in Jesus' name. However, for purposes of an example, if we were to fall behind on our taxes, maybe $3,000, it could be any amount that just seems,
dangerously high for you because you don't have it at that time, or maybe you're oblivious to the fact that you even owe tax money, because a lot of people are so dependent on their mortgage companies, their loan lenders, to make sure, to situate everything. But there comes a time you got to stay up on them niggas because they be tripping. And they be charging you when your taxes they're lower, but they take forever to do their escrow analysis. So you end up motherfucking spending extra money in these months that you should not have because your taxes lowered. But they wasn't going to say nothing to you. They just collecting it anyways. But anyways, so anything could cause you to fall behind on your taxes. Somebody come out the woodworks, they like that house, they like that area. They like, hold on, this person owes about $3,000 in taxes, or we'll even yank it up to the example we used with the 90-year-old woman who lost her house. She ended up with $3,000 arrears or falling behind in taxes. And then after the fees and all them stuff started to accumulate, she went from a $3,000 tax debt to about $15,000 tax debt. And this is a bedridden 90-year-old woman with poor health who ain't got no money like that. So paying $15,000 is ridiculous. It seems infeasible. You see what I'm saying? But to someone with a little pocket change, they like, what? I just paid $15,000. But that person probably bought their house for $189 or $200 or $300. And I just pay whatever is on their tax, which is almost a 1% of what they actually paid on the house. Baby, yeah, I'm in there and I'm taking it. Tax lien. That's what this sounds like. There is no record that they ever sold their land. It made no difference. Whites, money in hand, would pay the tax on land they did not own, and the clerk would note the transaction, simply ignoring the gap in ownership, ignoring the fact that they're not owners. Don't even reach out to the actual owners. It's just, you got money, they got a tax lien debt, you want to pay it? Okay, so now you are the legal owner of this property because you pay the taxes. Forget the mortgage, you pay the taxes. That's what this tax lien. In the 3 years after the explosion, nearly 2/3 of the black-owned farmland that had not been sold was appropriated in this way. Louis. With the racial ban still violently enforced, whites could feel confident that black owners would never appear and try to reclaim the land that they had left behind. And we hear lots of talks now where a lot of black people are talking about how their ancestors, their grandmas, their grandfathers, their great-grandparents, their great aunts, or what have you, were exposed. And there's some of them that talks about the fights that they've been fighting for decades trying to get their property back. And then there's some of them that talks about it in the sense of like, yeah, I remember once upon a time we owned all this land and then we just lost it. And now it's just, there's this hole, there's this gap in our memory where we recall possessing this land, but now we don't have it because of hatred, racism, bigotry. Chased us out of here, and we had no protection from our government. Even if someone was reckless enough to try, word spread that whites could defend the land seizures, not just with shotguns and pistols, but under a common law principle known as adverse possession. If a man went down to the county, I need to highlight this, adverse possession. My bad, y'all. I'm over here trying to circle this. Adverse possession. If a man went down to the county courthouse, signed an affidavit swearing he occupied the land continuously, openly, and notoriously, and had been paying taxes on the lots, then according to the state law, the original adverse possession would ripen into title after 7 years, since the owner had taken no steps to repossess his property. And most of the people didn't even know that they could challenge this. And by the time they find out they could, it's too late. Because after 7 years, Since the owner took no steps to get their property back, it stays in the hands of these new people. In Georgia, this legal right meant to encourage productive use of abandoned land, included the stipulation that any new claim must not have originated in fraud and must be public, continuous, exclusive, uninterrupted, and peaceable. Now, that last line, how is that even possible when the land was acquired by violence? Like, what? But I guess nobody cares when majority of the employee staffs are white and the victims to these, crimes are black. It's crazy. Common law. I'm coming back to this. Black owners abandoned land in Forsyth for many reasons, from armed invasion to arson to dynamite, but everyone in Georgia knew that none of them were remotely peaceable. You see? Nonetheless, when white residents walked down to the courthouse to register deeds on land they had long ago fenced in as their own, the county clerk rarely even raised an eyebrow. Sounds about right. In 1912, the expulsion of Forsyth's black population had made news all over the country, but the thefts that followed were given a legal stamp of approval by the state, and they went unnoticed by anyone but the expelled black property owners themselves. Sound about right. I still got kinfolk to this day talking about stuff like this. In 2026, and at this point, it was 100 years ago now. Crazy. By the early 1920s, the elementary schools of Cumming were filled with a generation of white children who had no memory of the black people who once occupied those stolen lots. Most had never even seen a black resident of Forsyth and never would. Crazily, I met a girl in the Marine Corps when I had first joined in 2010. I went to boot camp. I think I met this girl probably like a few months later. I want to say it was like Marine combat training. And she was like from Washington State. And I'll never forget this girl. I'm like 18 at the time. And she told me she ain't never seen a black person in real life until she had, at that time when she was in the military. At that point, she said she only had seen black people on TV. She made us sound like unicorns, bro. Now, I don't hear too much of black people residing in Washington State, but come on, I know there's some over there. I met a girl, Farquharson. That chick was from Omaha, Nebraska. Sounds crazy. But apparently, Omaha, Nebraska actually has a pretty, noticeable black population. But yeah, this was 2010, 2011-ish. And I met a girl who ain't never even seen a black person in real life. And she was like talking like, oh my gosh, you guys are so cool and you're so pretty and you look at your skin. It was crazy. I was like, wow. It don't matter what time frame you look at. White people always look at colored people the same. Like, even if I seen somebody that I ain't never seen before, I'm just not about to make it weird and be like, whoa, look at your skin. Oh my gosh, can I touch your hair? That's what? It's weird, bro. As the Macon Telegraph put it in 1921, the Forsyth more or less pride is taken that they have run out all the Negroes. With the violent raids of 1912 receding into the past, it became possible for civic leaders to boast that while other northern Georgia communities continued to suffer episodes of race trouble, there was no such embarrassments in Forsyth. The signs that African Americans once lived there had already begun to fade, and the remnants of that old world were visible only to those who knew where to look. A reporter driving north from Atlanta in January of 1921 wrote that soon after the Chattahoochee has been crossed, a lone brick chimney stands amid blackened ruins And a mile further, on an old stove rises above a pile of stones which once formed the foundations of a little church and school. That hatred led them to tear down, burn down a church and school. And I bet you that these people will be sitting up in their church pews on Sunday talking about hallelujah, praise Jesus. It's crazy. Jesus is far from you. You don't want to hear them words, get from me. You I do not know. A lot of y'all gonna hear those words. May God have mercy on you. Many readers must have recalled the year when mobs drove more than 1,000 black residents out of Forsyth County. Yet the article made no mention of how that abandoned house first turned into blackened ruins, or who had once occupied that little church and school, now turning into a pile of mossy stones. Night riders continued to make headlines in other Georgia counties in the early 1920s, but having once been synonymous with lawlessness, Forsyth found that its race troubles were quickly forgotten by many whites and its reputation was already being rehabilitated. When in 1923, the Atlanta Constitution asked a North Georgia man named Arnold B. Hall to write a profile of the county, he made no mention of the expulsions and called Forsyth a famed county of grand old Georgia, where rich lands, rotation of crops, and marked advancement in animal industry and horticulture activity are awakening the people with a new purpose, a dynamic zest, and a vigorous vision. Forsyth County's white defenders are quick to point out that the racial purge of 1912 was not, as is often believed, absolute. And records confirm that while nearly all of the 1,098 people listed as black or mulatto in 1910 were gone from Forsyth by 1920, when a census taker named Vester Buse made his rounds in February of that year, he did eventually come upon a small group of black families living in the Big Creek section along Forsyth's southern border with Milton County. I have heard numerous stories about black people during slavery, even post-slavery, right around the time all the explosions were taking place, that black people would literally retreat to the swamps of South Carolina, where Parris Island is, right, where I went and trained to become a Marine. Parris Island was once a prominent city that was heavily populated by black people. Beaufort, that whole swamp area, yeah. A bunch of black people used to live there. And it was a huge space for like seafood fishing, rice farming, all that. Tell you. So you got to pick up a book and read. I'm trying to figure out where the figure I left out of. Okay. The families of Ed and Bertha Moon, Will and Corey Strickland, and Marvin and Ruby Rocks were all clustered together at the bottom edge of the county, as far as one could get from Oscarville and still be in Forsyth. The most prosperous of the group was Will Strickland, whose father, James, had been born a slave on the Strickland plantation in 1850. My bad, y'all. The Strickland farms were so notorious for their harsh treatment of slaves that Hardy, the family patriarch, had become known far and wide as Devil Hard Strickland. But James Strickland stayed in Forsyth even after emancipation, and he was among the young, newly freed black men of the county when in 1867 he signed his oath of allegiance at the Cumming Courthouse. Just like Joseph Kellogg, he seems to have been both industrious and patient, For by 1900, after decades of sharecropping and saving, he and his wife Rosanna owned the property they worked in Big Creek. By 1910, James' son Will was farming their land and doing well enough, at least, to support a family with 10 children. Good on you, my brother. Good on you. Apologists for Forsyth have often pointed to the 1920 census roll and those 23 black residents living around Will Strickland's farm in an attempt to deny that African Americans were forced out. Of course. They always use these like outliers and they exemplify them, blow them up, exaggerate them, and then try to paint them as the mother freaking, you know what I'm saying? As the standard. Weirdo. But it seems clear that 23 people returning to the county after more than 1,000 have been banished does not mean the purge was any less violent or widespread than what was reported in the newspapers. Instead, it suggests that a kind of exemption, or at least protection, was granted to these employees of the white Strickland family whose power in the country was unmatched. You see what I'm saying? There is no way to know exactly where the black Strickland, Moon, and Rots families went during the first waves of violence, but there is strong evidence that they fled along with the rest of the African American community. When Ed Moon filled out a World War I draft card in 1918, he was living 40 miles east of Cumming in Maysville, a town the white Stricklands had helped found in Jackson County in the 19th century. Jackson happened to be the birthplace of Forsyth's largest slave owners, Hardy, Tolbert, and Oliver Strickland. I know there's some of y'all out there that's related to these people. It was still home to many of their kin. One likely scenario is that when the mobs of Forsyth threatened black employees like Ed Moon, the white Stricklands simply relocated them to other family farms in Jackson County. We just gonna hide you on my family's plantation. Whether it was the lure of wages, the threat of punishment, or a lack of any better option, at some point after 1918, at great risk, those 23 people stepped back across the invisible line and were counted as Forsyth residents in 1920. No mention was made in the papers. No mobs assembled at the edge of the Strickland place, and there is no record of their presence other than those few entries that Vestibuse scrawled in his census ledger. Now, if you go back to previous motherfucking chapters that we read, you will find this Strickland family is a hot mess. So, yeah, hot mess combined with money, baby, I see why them people ain't coming on there. You know what I'm saying? For all we know, Strickland probably sent them, you know, all them crazy white people to start terrorizing. As enraged as locals had been at the sight of the Seeing Georgia chauffeurs, they likely knew better than to test the rich and powerful white Strickland clan. That small cluster of black people at the southern edge of the county still numbered 16 in the census of 1930. Then at some point in 1930, they were gone. The Moons to Gainesville, Will and Corey Strickland just 9 miles south to Milton County near Alpharetta, and Marvin and Ruby Rocks to some new life of which no traces survived. Across the Chattahoochee in Hall County, Jane Daniel, which is the lady that testimony, she was coerced into giving a testimony, and her testimony incriminated her kinfolk for a murder of May Crow to which they did not commit. So she lost her kinfolk to save her own life. Yeah, that Jane Daniel was just starting to imagine a more ambitious escape, not just from the lynchers and night riders of Forsyth, but out of the South altogether. I don't blame you, girl. In the census of 1920, we can still find her, age 29, pining white people's damp clothes to the line in her backyard. Pinning white people's damp clothes to the line in her backyard. As somewhere in Gainesville, Will Butler gripped the wooden handle of a pair of steel pincers and lugged a 50-pound block of ice through the back door of a white man's mansion. But when the census taker came back to Atlanta Street in 1930, neighbors said that Will and Jane were gone, having boarded a northbound train at the depot in Gainesville and joined so many other young black people of their generation in the Great Migration. Migration. Great Migration. Now, why would they refer to citizen-born folks as migrating when that's been interchangeably used in reference to immigrants and immigration? It's because migrants pertains to native-born. Immigrants and migrants do the same thing. They move to a different location in hopes of finding a better life, achieving American dream, all that wonderful jazz. The only difference is one's native citizen, documented, one's not. Only difference. I don't blame them, though. A bunch of young people migrated. Young people ain't got time for the foolery. You hear me? Every generation, I don't care what generation you look at, young people ain't got no time for the foolery. By the early 1930s, Jane, Daniel, and Will Butler were renting a house at 467 Theodore Street in the Paradise Valley neighborhood of Detroit. Interesting. And she come from Forsyth County, Georgia, and relocated all the way to Detroit, Michigan. And black people be quarreling amongst one another like we ain't kinfolk. We are related, especially if your people come out of South Carolina. Andrews, Sumter, Kingstree, we can. But anyways, Jane suddenly found herself at the center of a booming industrial metropolis. Since the record shows that Jane and Will's neighborhood was filled with others who had been born to sharecroppers and field hands in Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Virginia, and Mississippi, but who now worked as cooks, maids, bricklayers, and night watchmen. Here's the shift. So they went from farm hands, farm workers, just constantly working in that regard, to now they're cooks, maids, bricklayers, which are mostly jobs associated with northern living. And more than anywhere else, the black residents of Detroit worked in the bustling factories of Motor City, Fisher Body at the corner of Piquette and St. Antoine, Cadillac's Detroit Assembly on Clark Street, and the Hudson Motors plant off Jefferson Avenue. Whereas the backdrop of her youth had been pine forests, cotton fields, and the lazy, deep green waters of the Chattahoochee, the second half of Jane's life would play out amidst smokestacks and glowing steel ingots in a city whose pulse in its heyday one visitor described as the sound of a hammer against a steel plate. Yeah. Cities are loud. Cities are loud. Ingots. One migrant of Jane's generation described the life she left behind in the Jim Crow South as like sleeping on a volcano which may erupt at any moment. And Jane must have felt a similar kind of relief once she and Will were settled in Detroit, to be out of Georgia and beyond the reach of the white people who had killed her first husband, Rob, and celebrated the hanging of her brother, Oscar, and her cousin, Ernest. So they pretty much killed her whole family. I forgot that Rob was her husband. And they also killed Oscar. And they killed these men just because they're black. Rob, if I'm not mistaken, Rob was visiting. Rob Edwards. He was visiting. Will and Jane never had children, but the nieces and nephews who knew them in Detroit all understood that Aunt Janie and Uncle Will had begun their lives far away, among the crackers and Klansmen down in Georgia. Georgia, they said years later, was not a place Auntie Janie ever talked too much about. But if the Butlers thought that they had escaped white terrorism, they and the rest of Detroit got a rude awakening in the summer of 1943. Interesting, because people associate northern states with absence of slavery. And there's not a northern city from a northern state, especially one that had a pretty decent black population, that has not endured some form of like turmoil. Like here in Rochester, in 1964, there was a riot between white police officers and black residents over a guy who went to one of the Clarissa like street, the block party, and the cops just started harassing him. Black people came over to stand with one another like, why are you bothering this man? And before you know it, it was like a standoff for damn near 2 weeks. They had the New York State Troopers, county sheriffs here, local police here, paddy wagons. They was arresting people, all types of wild stuff. And then they even called in the National Guard and had them niggas camping here for up until they left, like damn near 2 weeks later. And this is a repeated motif that is seen amongst various states in the United States of America, amongst various cities in the United States of America, especially medium to big size cities. But let's continue. But if the Butlers thought that they had escaped white terrorism, they and the rest of Detroit got a rude awakening in the summer of 1943, when the white people of the city decided that they too would declare a racially cleansed zone and draw an invisible line that blacks could cross only at risk of their lives. Racial tensions had been building since the first trainloads of migrants began arriving from the South after World War I. So after World War I, we got a bunch of black people migrating from the South. You got a bunch of white people upset about the migrating black people. And then when you look in 2026, you know, and you look at the rhetoric surrounding immigrants, refugees, it's damn near identical to the rhetoric surrounding black people who were literally chased out of the South and moved up north. Interesting how the oppressed becomes the oppressor. Interesting how we just continue to perpetuate the very things that we despise. But let's continue. The African American population of the city was just about 6,000 in 1910. But by 1929, some 120,000 new black residents had settled in Detroit. And a decade later, in 1940, that number had nearly doubled to 200,000. During that same span of years, European immigrants were also arriving in unprecedented numbers. European immigrants, aka white immigrants. Let me put that up at the top, because I'll be having to come back to this. White immigrants. And this is the 1940s. So this whole like influx of immigrants, refugees and such, migrants, immigrants, it tends to just recycle and happen every so often. And then we see and hear the same tired actions and rhetoric being pushed and spewed. So anyways, during that same span of years, European immigrants were also arriving in unprecedented numbers. And for many of the same reasons, the magnetic draw of high wages and low unemployment and a chance to escape the violence and deprivation they'd suffered in their homelands. Would you look at that? White Europeans ran to the south, to the northern locations for many of the same reasons as black people did. High wages, lower unemployment, a chance to escape violence and deprivation suffered at the hands in their homelands. Interesting. Let me note that too. We're going to note it as white refugees. All right, let's continue. I'm pretty sure we're going to stumble upon some double standards here. By the early 1940s, there were simmering tensions between whites and blacks in the cities. Interesting. And they boiled over into the winter of 1942. That was the year the federal government opened the new Sojourner Truth housing project, which was built especially for poor black families. Oh my goodness. White people probably looked at this and perceived, oh, these black people are getting government handouts. They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Wow. Pretty sure that's what's month's rent. Whites formed a picket line. This one I don't care nothing about no white picket fence. Because it's white people forming picket lines to keep out black people. You see the parallel? And it be white people that be wanting that white picket fence. You are the white picket fence. But anyways, let me make my little note. Whites formed a picket line in front of the building, and when two cars driven by black men tried to force their way, and when two cars driven by black men tried to force their way through the line, a melee broke out. The violence ended only when mounted police arrived with shotguns and tear gas. In April of 1942, 168 black families finally moved into the housing complex under the protection of the Detroit Police Department and 1,600 troops of the Michigan National Guard. Now, you have to remember, because people love to talk about how poor black people are, they living on handouts. But a lot of these people ended up in these housing projects because they just migrated from the South, and the northern locale that they moved to didn't have the resources to accommodate that high influx of people. They talking about in a span of like less than 10 years, the population of black people went from like barely 1,000 to like 200,000. In addition to that, you got a high influx of white European immigrants who are also seeking the same thing that black people are seeking. Adequate wages, the lower chances of unemployment, to get from the mayhem and the chaos that you just came from. But they're being subjected to living in these housing projects as a quick and simple fix to address the issue that you got all these people flocking here. And it's probably having some impact on homeless rates. And y'all know how people are with their homeless rates. They like to be like, oh, wait, hold on, baby. What you think you doing to me? I can't have y'all hanging out on these streets. You make the streets look slummy and bummy. I'm going to put you in jail so we ain't got to see you. In April of 1942, 168 black families finally moved into the housing complex. Under the protection of the Detroit Police Department and 1,600 troops of the Michigan National Guard, like Jane and Will Butler, the great majority of those families had migrated to Detroit from the South. As they went to bed on their first night in Sojourner Truth, with the racist taunts of whites rising up past the windows of the new high-rises, many must have wondered if they had simply traded one band of night riders for another. So the people that be sitting here trying to make it seem like racism is solely associated with the South and as if it's just vacant when it comes to Northern. I mean, baby, pick up a book. You could walk into almost any college and you get a hold of their historical pictures. And when I say historical pictures, I'm talking about less than 100 years ago. It is not uncommon to see quite a bit of some of these founders, some of these prominent leaders, judges, members of Congress, people who has the ability to make stuff happen with the push of a pen, changing laws, are now governing the very people that they mocked in their youth. It's crazy because here in Rochester, we have found out that one of the judges that has sat, I couldn't remember if it was a county Supreme Court judge, a county judge, or a city court judge. But it was found that one of them went to RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology. Somebody went through some of their old pictures and they found the nigga wearing blackface. You see what I'm saying? That's crazy. Let's continue. The chaos at Sojourner Truth was only a prelude to what Jane and Will experienced the following summer, when 25,000 workers at Packard walked off the assembly line because black employees had been promoted to jobs that placed them shoulder to shoulder with whites. Thousands of workers at Packard walked off the assembly line because black employees had been promoted to jobs that placed them shoulder to shoulder with whites. But then there's many of y'all that says racism doesn't exist, it's never exist, there's no effect of it happening today. And a lot of y'all are the descendants of these very white people. These white people aren't wealthy, they're not prominent. These are blue-collared employees. Working class white folk. Niggas poor. I told y'all about this book, the story, the ethnographic story of this white dude who was dying, literally dying from health issues. He was hooked up to an oxygen tank. And when he was asked about voting for universal health care or politicians that are proponents of universal health care, that nigga straight up said that he refused to vote for universal health care or any proponents to universal health care because he didn't want to help black and immigrants get on to have health coverage. And would you believe that this man in this book shortly after died from his health complications? That nigga was so damn selfish that he voted against something that would have immediately benefited him. But he was looking at it like, but you get to use it. F me. I don't need it. If you get access to it, then F it. None of us get access. And now that man dead. Probably not even buried. Cremated and mixed in with somebody else's ashes sitting in somebody else's urn. It's crazy. But this is what hypocrisy and hatred gets you. You look stupid. Foolish. As one enraged man said outside the plant, I'd rather see Hitler and Hirohito win than work beside a nigger. I'd rather see Hitler. See, when people be trying to make it seem like there's a feud between whites and Jews, I don't believe it. Because this is supposed to be a white man. And he said he'd rather see Hitler and Hirohito, who I'm assuming is a Japanese man, win, which would have a drastic effect on the entire U.S. and the entire world, just to avoid sitting next to black people who he called a nigger. The shoving and shouting outside Packard turned to more serious violence on the night of June 20th, 1943. 1943 is the same year that legislation revolving around the banning and prohibition of Asians into the United States. That is the year that they were repealed. So when people sit here and wonder, well, why the U.S., in the U.S., the Asian population is so small. Well, from 1882 to 1943, they was prohibited from living here, buying property here, existing here, to where even native-born individuals were deported. But you got many people out here who says, if you're documented, if you're a citizen, you can't get deported. But there's all this motherfreaking, these examples out here showing otherwise. That yes, you too can get deported, even if you consider the documented, even if you consider native born, even if you consider citizenship. Why? Because just like they did Mr. Che Payne, they'll do you the same way, where they invalidate your credentials that states that you are legally allowed to exist, to own property, to do whatever you do. But let's continue. 12:30. All right. The shoving and shouting outside Packard returned to more serious violence on the night of June 20th, 1943, when two young black men were expelled from B.A.R. Park in the middle of the Detroit River. On the bridge linking the park to the city, a skirmish broke out between groups of blacks and whites. In the wake of the clash, a rumor quickly spread across the city that blacks had raped and murdered a white woman, Lord have mercy, on the B.A.R. Bridge. Many people surely recognize this as the old threadbare lie that had fueled half a century of lynch law in the South. But once infuriated whites believed that a gang of black men had violated and killed a white woman and thrown her body into the river, it hardly mattered that the story was untrue. If Jane dared to venture out into the city during the 3 days that followed, she would have witnessed a familiar scene: black bodies being dragged through the streets by gangs of white men. Witnesses told of mobs ambushing and beating black passengers as they stepped down off trolley cars. A 58-year-old black man named Moses Kiska being shot and killed for waiting at a bus stop in the wrong part of town. But then people be trying to make it seem like black people are inherently violent. I don't know. History does not show that, at least not here in the United States. And an unnamed black man being bludgeoned on Woodward Avenue as 4 white police officers looked. Jane and Will's house was just 2 blocks from Woodward, in the middle of what quickly became a war zone. By the time military troops arrived to stop the rampage, there were 34 confirmed killings. 34. Most of the victims had been beaten to death with wooden clubs. Langston Hughes wrote that, at least in the North, he had his own window to shoot from. And in June of 1943, in Detroit, that's exactly what black residents like Jane and Will Butler did. Keep watch with loaded rifles, stiff-jawed as they waited for the roving mobs. Many of the attackers had European instead of Southern accents. That's crazy. Many of the attackers had European instead of Southern accents. Many of the attackers had European instead of Southern accents. And we just talked about the influx of white Europeans. Nigga, you're a foreigner. Literally. We native born niggas the black folk just migrated up here, but they was born, documented here. You, 9 times out of 10, especially Jewish and Italians, y'all come up out of Ellis Island and ain't had no papers. In fact, a common racial slur towards Italians, undocumented, is WAPs, meaning without papers. But you wreaking havoc on black people who are citizens of the United States, who just migrated from the South up north, and you want to bring contention and quarrels? But you got a whole European accent. Like, take all that down south and see how them white people with that Southern accent treat y'all niggas with them motherfucking European accents. Many of the attackers had European instead of Southern accents, but their faces were contorted with the same hatred Jane had seen so many times in Forsyth. All she could do, as so often in her life, was hope that the future might be different. As it is said on the flags flying over Detroit City Hall, Speramus Meliora, we hope for better things. Now, it's crazy because people try to associate hatred and racism with a certain type of white group. But at the end of the day, it's all of y'all. Whether you consider yourself a European, American born, got an accent, American accent, it don't matter. One and the same, 2 peas in the pie. During the same decades that Jane and Will struggled to build a new life in the North, Forsyth was deep in its sleep of forgetfulness. As all around the state of Georgia veered even further in the direction of white supremacy. The 1933 governor's race was won by Eugene Talmadge, a southern Georgia farmer who proudly grazed a cow on the lawn of the governor's mansion and courted the votes of poor rural whites by casting himself as the last line of defense against a Negro takeover. Lord have mercy. Talmadge held the governorship for 3 terms between 1933 and 1943 and was according to writer Gilbert King, a racial demagogue who presided over a Klan-ridden regime. A demagogue is basically a demagogue is a person who uses feeling evoking language to get you to make decisions, right? They don't bring knowledge, wisdom, facts, or anything. They just solely appeal to your emotions, and they try to get you to make, judgments and decisions out of your emotions. So when they say they call him a racial demagogue, he probably was just using rhetoric playing on the white and black, spiel that got him to get those votes by the rural white people. In a typical campaign speech in 1942, Talmadge answered a question about school integration by reassuring his segregationist base before God. Now, that's the crazy part. These niggas be, to God be the glory, in God we trust. We're Christians, oh, just good Christians. But then they be out here saying, before God, friend, the niggers will never go to a school which is white while I am governor. But to God be the glory. I mean, to God be the glory regardless. It's crazy that the same lips that claims that they part ways to give praise and adulation to the Most High turn around and part ways and motherfucking disparage people just based on differences. External differences at that. One of the few glimpses from inside Forsyth during this period comes from a white woman named Helen Matthews Lewis, who moved into the county as a 10-year-old in 1934 when her father was hired as a county mail carrier. Lewis remembered the white community still very much in the grips of its original paranoia and still openly proud of having run the niggers out in 1912. I was told stories as a child, Lewis said, about how they hung blacks around the courthouses. I knew they lynched the guy that they were accusing of the rape of May Crow. Stories were told. I could just see bodies hanging all around the courthouse in my mind. Lewis sometimes caught sight of frightened black deliverymen passing through the county in 1930s. Back then, blacks coming in through town on trucks to deliver stuff to the stores were afraid to get out. They would hide in the back. Lewis also remembered that many Forsyth residents were quick to react to even the slightest trespass across the racial border. From the appearance of a black worker on the back of a truck to an old man who stayed in Forsyth while riding a bicycle north toward Hall County. My father came home from his mail route one day, Lewis said, and he said he saw this old black man bicycling through town on his way to Gainesville. My father said, I'm worried he's got to go through Chastity, past the rowdy boys of Chastity. My father said, he'll never make it. So he gets in his car and he said, I'm going to go find him. Then he goes and picks him up and takes him to Gainesville. Well, good on you, brother. Appreciate the kind gesture. May God provide a place for you in heaven as long as you continue to live right. You know what I'm saying? Lewis remembered how another outsider violated the unwritten code in the 1930s, or in the late 1930s, a woman who moved to the county with her long-serving black maid. When I was in school at Forsyth County High, Lewis said, this teacher comes to town who had this black woman who was a companion, maid, a person who'd always been in their family. And she taught music And the woman lived with her until these boys came with torches and surrounded her house and made her get up in the middle of the night and take the black woman back to Alabama. When an interviewer in 2010 interjected, "Oh, goodness," Lewis said, "These were my experiences in Forsyth in the 1930s and 1940s. There was a sense of horror." Lewis was clearly frightened by tales of lynched men hanging from telephone poles and by the sight of black workers hiding under tarps when they passed through Cumming, but to her schoolmates, white Forsyth seemed like the natural and eternal order of things. By 1941, when Lewis graduated from Forsyth County High, most traces of the black community had long since been burned, dismantled, or silently absorbed into the property of whites. Of that former time, all that was left was fleeting glimpses visible only to someone who paid very close attention. Not long before she moved out of the county, Lewis remembered, she was walking up to a friend's front door and noticed faint inscriptions in the stepping stones that led up to the house. It was only when she knelt down for a closer look that Lewis realized that the path she'd been walking on was paved with remnants of black Forsyth. They were gravestones, she said, from a black cemetery. Someone had dug them up and took them home and used them for flagstones. Damn. That's motherfucking crazy. She said she was walking up to a friend's front door. You got dug up gravestones utilized as flagstones as you walk up to your friend's front door? Nigga, what you mean someone had dug them up? It was your friend and their connection. The civil rights clashes of the 1950s and 60s came and went without changing much in the lives of Forsyth's quiet country people who in the decades after World War II had been busy erecting chicken houses in their old corn and cotton fields. As America's expanding poultry industry brought new prosperity to northern Georgia, the county seat may have been just a short drive from Ebenezer Baptist, the home church of Martin Luther King Jr., and one of the epicenters of the American Civil Rights Movement. But with no black residents to segregate from whites, there was no colored drinking fountains in the Cumming courthouse, and no whites-only signs in the windows of Cumming's diners and roadside motels. Instead, as segregationists all over the South faced off against freedom riders, civil rights marches, and lunch counter sit-ins, Forsyth was a bastion of white supremacy that went almost totally unnoticed. Even as the nation changed around it, Forsyth's old unspoken rules remained, and each new generation of enforcers clung to the code their parents and grandparents had handed down. In May of 1968, just a month after King was assassinated, a group of 10 black school children came north from an Atlanta housing project as part of a church camping trip led by 2 white Mennonite counselors who were unaware of Forsyth's racial prohibition. Lord have mercy. At dusk, as the children pitched their attention to the scenic campground beside Lake Lanier, this is 1968, a gang of white men appeared out of the darkness and forced the group to leave, warning them that we don't allow niggers in this county after dark, sundown town. When Atlanta activists returned a week later to protest the intimidation, they had to be protected by the Georgia State Patrol as whites gathered around the campsite chanting, "Wait until the night comes." Asked about the clash, Roy P. Otwell, president of the Bank of Cumming, assured a reporter that while he was sorry to read of it, this sort of thing does not represent Forsyth. When we have an incident of this kind, it is overplayed and much exaggerated, and the people of Forsyth are greatly misunderstood. Boy, shut up. No. By the early 1970s, many of the lynchers and night riders had begun to die off, taking with them the last living memories of the explosions. The identities of these men will probably remain a mystery forever now. No, it won't. Just like every other group of people pass down experiences through storytelling, so does white people. You best believe that all this night riding and racial terrorizing that they've been doing has been passed down in storytelling. Okay? It just ain't getting to the public. Because, I mean, we live in a time where being racist ain't cool, openly. But the account of Marcus Mashburn, a local doctor, leaves little doubt that many of them were well known residents who, after waging a months long campaign of terror against their own neighbors, went back to quiet lives as farmers, storekeepers, tradesmen, and God fearing church going Christians. Mashburn was a country doctor who had practiced for decades in Forsyth, and late in his life, he told an interviewer that in traveling over the county to wait on the sick, I attended many of the men who took part in the riots and lynching on their deathbeds. Mashburn described old men racked with guilt over the events of 1912, probably while you on your deathbed. You better repent before that breath draws up out of you, because, baby, hell will open your eyes. Talking about church going, Jesus be like, get for me. I do not know you. Anyways, I attended many of the men who took part in the riots and lynching on their deathbeds. Mashburn described old men racked with guilt over the events of 1912 and said he watched a number of them die horrible deaths because of their part in the Negro lynching. You reap what you sow. Touch not my anointed and do my prophet no harm. God pays back all of us according to our deeds. Y'all better read that Bible. Even 60 years later, the doctor was careful not to name any names or to spell out too clearly the obvious conclusion. See, ain't nobody gonna hold names when it's a nobody. Like, it's because a lot of these names, these are prominent people. Like, yeah, some of them might have been farmers and, motherfucking storekeepers and stuff. But Sheriff Reed was one of them. And he attended church with them niggas. And he allowed it. And he was a sheriff. You see what I'm saying? Even 60 years later, the doctor was careful not to name any names or to spell out too clearly the obvious conclusion that Rob Edwards had been murdered not by parties unknown and not by Klansmen flooding down out of the hills, but just as Ruth Jordan remembered, by regular people of the county. After a few generations of silence, what began as an open secret had become a carefully guarded one, revealed only at the very end and only to a select few. As they grew older, their minds were burdened by having had part in the killing, Dr. Mashburn said. And in their last moments, this thing they knew was wrong. I'm telling you, because when your time come, I really believe that people are fully aware that they are about to die. And I really do believe that in the process of you dying, your whole life flashes before your eyes, man. And you see everything. And when you realize that you have committed more wicked behavior than you have shown that you are a man or woman of God, baby, I think panic starts to sit in and niggas start to really realize hell is real. And hell will be parting their eyeballs wide open. Man, I tell y'all this. If you do not know Jesus, we finished with the reading of today. But if you do not know Jesus, you better get to know him, baby. Because hell ain't, people be trying to, I'm on demon timing and all that. They try to make it seem like Satan, hell, demons, and all that stuff is cute, cuddly, and just fun. Don't be a fool and go try it and see for yourself. Just don't. Don't. repent, turn from your wicked ways and talk to Jesus and take up to him every wild thing you've done, every wanton thing you've done, every immoral thing you've done. Bring it to Jesus and attempt to abstain from sin. Like, I know none of us are perfect, so we gonna sin. But the goal is to try not to, okay? Jeez, man. For those who tapped in with me, and everything, I really do appreciate y'all for tapping in and watching. Make sure you share this. That's my main thing, is just sharing so other people can be educated right along with us. You know what I'm saying? That's it. So, y'all know I love you. I love you. God bless and peace. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Yo, I'm telling y'all, I'm about to we about to have a church sermon on here one day. Let me get more skillful with playing the motherfucking keys. But y'all, I love y'all. Thank y'all for tuning in. I see y'all another day. I don't know when I'm gonna go live next, so y'all just stay up and stay in contact with the community. I'll be posting in there, a little community post, letting y'all know when I'm gonna go live and stuff. And know that if I say I'm gonna go live, you got about 24 hours, and I'm gonna go live. Okay. I'm gonna get better with my timing. I'm gonna get more punctual. But I love y'all. God bless. Peace. Y'all.